The relationship between India and Pakistan is
Welcome to the Family Research Council, and thanks for joining us for this afternoon's event. My name is Travis Weber, and I work here at FRC, where I direct the Center for Religious Liberty. At the Center for Religious Liberty, we seek to protect religious liberty through law and policy, and advance an appreciation and acceptance for religious liberty in culture at large. We care about protecting the religious liberty of those of all faiths. and seek to advance those protections because we believe that religious exercise in the public square nourishes and fuels the public and private life of our nation. In addition to advancing religious liberty for the sake of more free society, we believe robust practice brings many benefits to societies in which it occurs, benefits to individuals, families, and our economy and financial well-being, and this is a topic on which we'll hear more today. Dr. Brian Grimm is president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation and a leading expert on the socioeconomic impact of restrictions on religious freedom and international religious demography. For far too long, religious freedom and other human rights have been left to governments and civil society to handle and work to protect. Private business, however, can have a profound impact on these freedoms, and whether business supports or does not support such a culture of religious freedom has an impact on that freedom at large. The Religious Freedom and Business Foundation educates the global business community on how religious freedom is good for business and engages that business community and helps to join forces with government and non-government organizations to promote respect for freedom and respect for belief. Prior to becoming the president of the foundation, Dr. Grimm directed the largest social science effort to collect and analyze data on religion at the Pew Research Center. Dr. Grimm is a member, among other things, of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Role of Faith and serves as an advisor for the Religion and Geopolitics Project of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. He's also an associate scholar at the Religious Liberty Project at Georgetown University and an affiliated scholar at Boston University's Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. He's also worked for 2 decades as an educator in the former Soviet Union, China, Central Asia, and the Middle East and Europe. Dr. Grimm holds a doctorate in sociology from Penn State University and is author of numerous articles and books, including The Price of Freedom Denied, The World Religion Database, World's Religions and Figures, and the Yearbook of International Religious Demography. He also writes for the Weekly Number blog and is a TEDx speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Grimm.
Thank you. It's good to be with you this morning or this noontime. And I've been told that I should begin with a joke, and this is told by my 3-year-old grandson from Italy, where I just came from. And so I asked him to provide the joke. And so he delivers the joke better than I do. But it relates to my topic, which is really looking at statistics and numbers as they relate to religious freedom and its social and economic impact. One of the sort of a preface that I like to give is, what Mark Twain attributed to former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, that there's 3 kinds of statistics. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So that's a warning whenever you're dealing with numbers that you have to be careful how you use them. But my grandson has a different kind of warning about numbers. And I think many of you may know this joke, but he delivers it better than I do. So it's very simple. Why is 6 afraid of 7? Because 7, 8, 9, yes. That joke goes over very well with second language learners who haven't heard the joke before and pause a long enough time and they get it. Well, thinking of statistics, it can be a dizzying array of numbers and facts and figures, and there's so much information that we still hunger for knowledge. So I hope I can share some at least knowledge from the numbers, or at least my interpretation of the numbers. My journey into numbers and studying religion began many decades ago in China. In 1982, it was the first time I went to China to teach, by boat, incidentally, from Hong Kong up the coast of China. And at that time, no one knew whether or not religion had survived the Cultural Revolution that sought to stamp out all faith and all religious practice. But to my surprise and the surprise of almost all scholars, religion not only survived, but even thrived during the Cultural Revolution to such an extent that today China has more religious believers than any other country except India. Okay, half the population is unaffiliated, but still half is, and half of something in China is a lot of people. And that has the largest Buddhist population, the largest Taoist population, the largest folk religion population. It has the 7th largest Christian population and the 17th largest Muslim population. Well, my journey into religion and trying to quantify things came as I worked later in the Soviet Union. In 1989, I was on my way from Germany into the Soviet Union, where I was coordinating economic and cultural exchange projects. And on my way, I went through Berlin. And as I landed in Berlin in November of 1989, my friend ran up to me and he said, "Did you hear what's happening?" And I said, "No." And as my plane landed, we went right to the Berlin Wall. And as we went there, we were part of the crowds that were hacking at the wall and tearing it down. The next day we went through. We were the only people going east, as everybody from East Berlin was coming west. So it was an amazing experience, but it was really a new dawn for religion in the world, where for decades, almost 100 years, that the narrative had been defined by communism and sort of an anti-religious stance, and now that all fell almost in a day. And in fact, the Soviet Union, a few years after this, was dissolved in my office building in Almaty, where I was working with President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, who's still President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. Well, on September 11th, 2001, I was working in the Middle East in a town that had 20,000 people from Afghanistan, most of them identified as Taliban. The events of that day and the days and years now that have followed have forever changed how I look and think about measuring religious freedom, because the actions of just a few individuals on that day forever changed the dynamics of the world in ways that even a powerful government action has a very hard time replicating. So from these experiences, then I've begun a study beginning at Penn State, and then I carried it on while I was at the Pew Research Center, measuring restrictions on religious freedom or freedom of religion and belief coming from both governments, but also from groups in society. But before I share some of those statistics, why is religious freedom important? Well, there's a number of ways to answer that, but perhaps the most important is that most people adhere to a faith. 84% by the estimates that I've been working on, 84% of people have a faith. But even among the 16% of people who have no particular faith, many of them still hold beliefs and even religious practices very dear to them. So people with no faith, it's maybe just as important for them to have that freedom to choose not to have a faith as it is for others to have a faith. And even among the people that have no particular faith, in the United States, we find that 68% of them still believe in God. So because religion is important, religion or belief is very important to most people in the world, it's important to know how free someone is to have a faith, change their faith, or have no faith at all. But there's another reason, and this chart shows the median age of religious groups around the world. These were data collected when I was at the Pew Research Center, and the religiously unaffiliated are on average more than a decade older than Muslims. So the religiously unaffiliated are, globally speaking, a rather aging group. And when you think of projecting this forward to the future, that means that the women who are unaffiliated are older and they're moving out of the childbearing ages. Whereas religious groups, including Muslims, Hindus, Christians, other faiths, are younger on average, so there's more women in the childbearing ages. So just demographically, religion is going to grow faster than the unaffiliated. And even taking into account conversion and even the defection from groups like Christianity, these are not strong enough to overcome the demographic momentum of the future growth of faith in the world. So religion is an identity most people in the world have, and it's going to become even a more important part of the world in the future. So therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume religious freedom will become an even more important part of the world. But the measures on religious freedom show that it's in crisis. Today, about 43% of countries in the world have high or very high restrictions on religion, according to the Pew Research Center. And that's about 3/4 of the world's people are living in these countries, or 5.3 billion people today live with high restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. Not all of the people feel those restrictions because it's usually the minority groups, either a power minority or a numerical minority, that feel those restrictions most keenly. But that's the global situation of today. But this is markedly higher than just a few years ago, when less than 30% of countries had high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. So going from 29% to 43% is nearly a 50% increase in the number of countries, or the share of countries, with high religious restrictions. So by any way of looking at it, this can be considered a global crisis. To have such an increase in restrictions is a cause for concern. And that concern is not shrinking. By various measures, monitoring the number of countries where religion-related terrorists are active, that's been going up year by year. And the events in Iraq with the ISIS group taking over large parts of northern Iraq, the battle is ongoing, this is a problem that we have to face on an ongoing basis, and it's projected to continue in the years to come. Speaking of Iraq, it's important to look at what was the condition that opened the door for ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever the name you call it. What was the condition in that country before they came in? I published a blog just a little over a week ago with the World Economic Forum, and it was looking at ways for businesses to build peace. And in that, I looked at Iraq and used some Pew Research Center data to look at what were the main concerns of the Iraqi population in the year before ISIS moved in. Well, there were 5 main concerns. The number 2, 3, 4, and 5 were crime, corrupt political leaders. Religious group conflict was only number 4 out of the 5. Ethnic group conflict was the 5th concern. What do you think was number 1? Anybody?
Economic growth.
Exactly. Unemployment was the chief concern of the Iraqi population in the year before ISIS moved in. Northern Iraq, in particular, was an economically deprived region, so the ground was just soft for these terrorists to move in, and you can bet they looked at it. Osama bin Laden's strategy, as he noted years ago in 2006, was to bleed America dry, and the attack on the Twin Towers was no coincidence. Symbols of economic progress and success. So this correlation between terrorism and taking advantage of poor business and economic situations is also no coincidence. Doesn't mean that a bad economy causes terrorism, but terrorists, they understand that they have an open door. So how different might Iraq be today had the business community thought there's an opportunity there for business, just like the terrorists thought there's an opportunity for our message. The situation may be very different today. Well, so in what ways are freedom of religion or belief good for business? Well, one, I published a paper earlier this year in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Research on Religion that found that of 24 different factors that can predict GDP growth, religious freedom was one of only 3 that remained significant, controlling for everything else. Now, that doesn't in any way prove that religious freedom is the secret to economic growth, but what it does tell a researcher is that it shouldn't be ignored. There's something there to look at. GDP growth fluctuates from year to year, but there's something there to look at. So why might economic growth be related to religious freedom? Well, if you look at the pillars of global competitiveness as measured by the World Economic Forum, most of those, including things like primary education and health, secondary education, technological readiness, innovation, all of these pillars that help support sustainable economic growth are stronger in countries that have stronger records of religious freedom, and they're weaker in countries where you have less religious freedom. So these basic pillars are one clue why religious freedom might contribute to economic growth. Well, let's just take two of these, for instance. There's a recent article published in the American Political Science Review, perhaps the leading political science journal in the United States for sure, and perhaps the world, by one of my colleagues who works with me at Georgetown University, Bob Woodbury. And he did a study, a large, big data study, one that I would appreciate, that looked at economic, democratic, and social growth in areas where proselytizing Protestant missionaries had gone in the 1800s and 1900s. And what he found was that wherever a Protestant mission station had been established and missionary work was carried out, that those were the very places in Asia, South America, and Africa that were today the strong economic and democratic places in these areas. And now you could say, well, maybe that's because the missionaries went to the easy places that were going to develop anyway, or they went to the more developed places. Well, those were the kind of criticisms that Bob Woodbury had to face to get his article published here. And I think it was perhaps one of the most rigorously reviewed articles. And in the end, the journal said, well, you have a case. You know, really that missionary effort did help bring, economic development. So if you think about what missionaries brought, well, what's the first task of a missionary, a Protestant missionary? Well, it's first to teach somebody the Bible. Well, to teach somebody the Bible, you probably have to teach them to read. And then if you want to have the Bible in their language, you have to have a printing press. And then once you start interacting with people, you notice they're sick and impoverished. And so let's bring a hospital and let's bring some trade. So it's not that, so in that freedom to religious freedom to go out and share a message, there was economic development. I'm not necessarily making an argument that missionary work is the way to bring economic development for the future either, but that religious freedom involved in allowing these new ideas to come to places certainly was historically instrumental in that. And if you think of many hospitals, educational institutions in the United States, in many places, they were either begun or continued to be supported by religious organizations. So there is a role that having freedom in society has for building the basic building blocks of a strong economy. Another way that religious freedom helps to promote economic growth is it fosters innovation. Now, the picture up here, all of you know what that is, right? You've probably had it at one time or another in your life. Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and you all know the religious history of Kellogg's Corn Flakes, right? Anyone? No? Okay, well, Kellogg's Corn Flakes it started off in black and white, it's called Xanatos Toasted Corn Flakes by the Kellogg's brothers. So what's the religious part of this? Well, the Kellogg's brothers were in Battle Creek, Michigan, and they were part of the Seventh-day Adventist community in that area. And if you know anything about Seventh-day Adventists, one thing is that they're very concerned about nutrition. They follow the Leviticus Old Testament dietary laws. They don't eat pork. They're nearly vegetarians. They don't drink wine. So they're very concerned about health from their faith. And in fact, a number of Christian groups, they believe what St. Paul said, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So you should take care of that body. So what was happening that made them want to make cornflakes? Well, the main food for breakfast in the late 1800s in the United States was ham and greasy eggs and more grease and fat and ham. And they said, this is just going to kill the temple of the Holy Spirit. I don't think they actually said that, but that was their thinking, that this was, really not the way to start your day. So they made these toasted cornflakes. And originally they didn't have so much sugar in it. They were a little bit maybe healthier than the current version. So that's where cornflakes came from, this religious conviction to come up with a food that was better than what people were eating. And so the religious freedom that they had as Seventh-day Adventists is really a minority group within Christianity, to freely practice their faith and let their faith inspire new business ideas. Well, there's many, many examples of this that I won't go into right now. But I'll give one last one just so that you know that this eventually became Kellogg's, and it's not owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But this company, Sanitarium, notice Sanitas means health or well-being in Latin. Well, Sanitarium is the largest cereal company in Australia, and it is owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's a church-owned company, most successful, and their mission is to provide as they say, health and well-being to Australians. So spiritual health, physical health, that helps to build a nation. So again, this idea that where you give freedom to religious groups, you can have freedom to innovate. Well, some of these stories, including one from New York City, where there's a new favorite sidewalk food put out by the halal guys. So these are Muslims in New York City, and they've started the street side shops to sell halal food. And if you see that lined up getting their food are, not just Muslims. Everybody likes that. So religious freedom and protecting the faith of people, brings new innovations. And these are just some examples from the food business. And at the World Expo in Milan coming up in next year, the focus is on the business of food and energy for life. So at that expo, we're going to be having some sessions to tell these stories of how faith and freedom and the food business all interact. And so that's another way to think of religious freedom in the business sphere, is to let some of these stories, none of you knew about Kellogg's, right? So let some of these stories be known, how faith can inspire innovation and inspire business. And it's not a taboo topic. You can talk about your faith. You don't have to leave your faith behind when you think of business and innovative ideas. So we'll be having at the Milan World Expo, Cardinal Scola, the Archbishop of Milan, is helping to support that, as well as Milan University, the state secular university, will be supporting that with a Religious Freedom Study Center we'll be setting up. And then the idea is to take this message of how business and faith interact to the next World Expos. The next will be in Kazakhstan, a place where I've spent time in 2017 focusing on energy, and then in Dubai in 2020. So putting this idea of faith, freedom, and business on the platforms of these world events will be carrying the message forward. Well, that's why religious freedom is good for business. Now, how is business good for religious freedom? Because it sort of works both ways. Well, let me give a couple examples, and this is part of the research I'm doing, is how many countries have business initiatives that are aimed to reduce religious tensions and religious restrictions, and that's what I'm trying to look at. And I'll share just a couple examples of how business is part of this FORB, as they call it in Europe, freedom of religion or belief story, and why it's not just governments and civil society, not just laws and social policies, but also why business should be concerned about this and can play a very instrumental role. Some of these stories are in a new publication that I've worked with the United Nations and the UN Global Compact, which is the largest corporate social responsibility organization in the world with around 8,000 corporate members. But Ban Ki-moon a year ago started a new platform within this UN Global Compact called Business for Peace. And it's a rather different approach, and it mirrors the one that I'm sharing today. The Global Compact more or less tells businesses, okay, don't pollute the environment, don't, have sweatshops, don't do this, engage in sustainability. But the Business for Peace flips it around and says, well, what can businesses do in their core activities that help to lower the tensions that are really bad for business? that that create divisions, and really conflict and war is only good for bomb and bullet makers. But for the average business people, peace, stability is really critical to begin, maintain, and grow a business. Well, we published a resource that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon helped to launch in Indonesia just in August, called "Business: A Powerful Force for Supporting Interfaith Understanding and Peace." And I'll give just two examples of the case studies we had there. And one is from these two guys. They started a company called Meji Tours. Well, the guy on the right is a Jewish guy, and the guy on the left, on this side is the Jewish guy, and that side's the Muslim guy. They grew up in Jerusalem, hating each other. The narrative was the other side was the bad guy. Somehow they met, and they found out, hey, we get along. And they said, we should do something to help other Muslims and Jews know that they can get along too. And they said, well, let's start a business. And they started Meji Tours, where they took Jewish people to Muslim areas in the Holy Lands, and then they took Muslims to the to Jewish areas of the Holy Lands, and made a tourist business that was quite successful and breaking down these barriers. So quite an innovative business. And I don't know if I'm going to tell one of their secrets, but they have an idea, and they're working on an app so that when you walk around Jerusalem and you come by some church or mosque or synagogue or some holy place, your iPhone will ding and say, oh, here's this. And from a common ground understanding, well, to Jews this thing means this, and to Muslims it means that, and to Christians it means that. And so just this idea of trying to overcome religious barriers can initiate new business ideas. Wouldn't that be a cool thing? Walk around D.C. and there's a lot of interesting places here in D.C. that you might not even know are significant. So addressing these issues can come up with new business ideas. And they have won an award called the Intercultural Innovation Award from the BMW Group. The BMW itself as a company is trying to help other companies see that this is an important area to address, this interfaith understanding, basically religious freedom within the workplace and what businesses can do in the workplace and in society. So the BMW Group itself, in its factory in Munich, has over employees from over 130 different countries. So multiple religions, multiple languages. So as a multinational company, not just working out in the world, but even in its home plant, it realizes the importance of intercultural, interfaith understanding. So big business and small business, sort of get it. Maybe not everybody, but certainly, people do get it. Well, I'll give one other example from this publication that I showed you, and that's from Coca-Cola, and how religious freedom or addressing interfaith tensions can engender peace. And this is actually coming from research I had done while I was at Penn State, and I wrote a book that was mentioned, The Price of Freedom Denied, and that religious freedom is perhaps the element that can lower religious conflict. So where you have religious freedom, that pulls down religious conflict. Where you have no religious freedom, you have greater religious conflict. There's a whole lot more to fight about when you don't have freedom. You're trying to take the power. Well, companies like Coca-Cola understand this dynamic. So the situation, I'm going to show you a video from Coke, but the situation they were trying to address was Pakistan and India. If you know anything about that historical situation, not yet, not quite yet, I'll say it. So the situation in Pakistan and India is that they were, one country, one larger India under British rule, and then when British rule ended and they had independence, then Pakistan and India were divided into more or less a Muslim north and a Hindu south. So you have Hindus and Muslims in both. And so since then, it's been one of the most divided countries in the world. And for Coca-Cola, this is a problem, because if Coke is known as an Indian, the drink for Indians, an Indian drink, Pakistanis won't want to drink it. But if it's known as the Pakistani cola, the Indians won't want to drink it. So they realized the business needs to overcome this divide so that so Coke can be for everybody. Well, let's see what they did.
The relationship between India and Pakistan is one that has seen a lot of lows.
It's stressful, it's tense.
It seems it's not improving and it's getting worse.
It's only been 60 years that we have been apart. Before that, we were living harmoniously together.
I think all the strife would go away if you took away the barbed wires in the middle of the two countries.
It saddens me that we have this neighbor that we can't even go visit.
They have this perception which they've been ingrained in their heads that that's the bad guy. But when they actually meet them, they realize, you know what, he's just like me.
Mainly because there's no communication. They're near us, but we have no access to them. And it's sad, because together I think we would do wonders.
Creating an environment where young people can exchange ideas, thoughts, gestures, and take away that communication gap that exists.
If I have any opportunity to go to India, I'll surely go there.
The whole idea of actually touching hands, it's like communicating with each other without words, and that action speaks louder than anything else.
This is what we are supposed to do, right? We are going to take minor steps so that we are going to solve bigger issues.
It is more about, how similar we are as opposed to how different we are.
Togetherness, humanity, this is what we want. More and more exchange.
So I am not a representative of Coke. I have no stock in Coke, but it's quite amazing to see what looking at these religious divides and these cultural divides does to business, and what business has the potential to do about it. Well, some of these stories that I'm sharing, we're going to be collecting them and looking to have the first ever awards for businesses that promote interfaith understanding, peace, and religious freedom during the 2016 Rio Olympics. And in Brazil, a country that has, by Pew Research Center's measures, lower government restrictions on religion than even in the United States, that they're quite excited about this. I met with the Vice President of Brazil and told him, how good they rank in terms of religious freedom, and he jumped back and said, "Well, I didn't know that." He said, "I'm the vice president. I should know these things." And part of it is people don't focus on the good news. When you hear about religious freedom, what are your first thoughts? Well, what are the problems? And so this is a different approach to start thinking about not just the problems, but What are the solutions? Where are we seeing advances? Is there a new way to think about this? So then Vice President Timur said, well, what do you need? And I said, well, help us to carry out these awards and then take them forward, not just in Rio, but then take them to the next Olympics, take them then to South Korea for the Winter Olympics, Tokyo for the next Summer Olympics. And then the following Winter Olympics are going to be either in Kazakhstan or China. So, getting this on the agenda, the world agenda of how religious freedom is good for business and how business is good for religious freedom are part of the objectives we're working on. Well, this is a businessman, a billionaire from Brazil, Carlos Wizard Martins, and he got excited about this message as I was sharing it in Brazil, and he's joined the World Economic Forum, and just this week he produced a video about why Brazil is #1 in the world in religious freedom and how that relates to business, and he's gotten excited about it, and he went with me on a trip to Finland to help promote this idea of waste to wealth. Well, let me explain that a little bit. So this is a picture of Dalits in Pakistan. And so the Dalits are the untouchable class of Hinduism. So within Hinduism, there's different castes, caste structure, upper and lower, and so the Dalits are at the bottom, and they've been reincarnated into this life that they need to work and suffer through so they can then get reincarnated into a higher caste later on and eventually, achieve, salvation from this cycle. Well, for the Dalits in Pakistan in particular, there's some groups that have been working with them. One in particular is the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission. And for years, they've been trying to change the discrimination against the Dalits in Pakistan to almost no success. So many have converted to Christianity or Islam, and in the churches they're being bombed. People are being sentenced to death for blasphemy. You may see the news that the first woman ever sentenced to death for blasphemy in Pakistan is now, almost on death row, and that may be upheld. Christian woman who had some critical comments to say about Islam. So it's not an easy, it's a life and death situation. So this Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission couldn't see how they can help the Dalits. Policy wasn't working, changing laws wasn't working. And then I said, well, have you ever thought about business? And I asked them and then met with their ambassador to Pakistan and said, when a business person looks at this picture, they don't look at the eyes of the young girl. They're seeing all that money there is to be made in garbage. You can recycle it. You can turn it into energy. And just the business of managing it, there's a lot of money in that. So why not take the Dalits, who are considered the garbage pickers, that's their status in life, and turn them into waste managers. And then through that, empower them through sustainable good business to, okay, they're going to stay in the garbage business, but be successful at it. And then through that, sort of overcome some of the stigma towards them. And the mission said, this is the first new ideal in religious freedom that we've encountered that's hopeful. They said, let's do that. So this businessman I mentioned, Carlos Wizard Martins, he got excited about it, went with me to Finland. We had meetings with the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission, the foreign ministry, recycling companies, waste management companies, the main university in Helsinki, and their funding agency, Tekas, which funds innovation. And so the mission has now said, this is going to be our policy. This is going to be our strategy for religious freedom. We're going to, work around the issue by empowering the people who are really being discriminated against and lift them up. So that's a new way of thinking about religious freedom. And, this idea has been one that, some more good news, is being given some attention at the United Nations, like I've shared, the European Parliament. Even people in Congress are, looking at these new approaches to religious freedom. Last week I was in London meeting in the House of Lords and sharing about these ideas. And there's interest from there, and I could share more stories of how Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is convening business leaders to look at some of these issues. Well, another side to this is that in in the United Kingdom, other European countries, Canada, as we heard yesterday, the Canadian soldier who was run down by someone who's radicalized. There's a growing problem within many countries of Islamic radicalization. So this ISIS group is inspiring people in Western countries, and it's usually people who are often economically or socially disenfranchised. So the UN Business for Peace group in the United Kingdom is interested to see how we could set up what's called self-reliance centers to reach out to people who are vulnerable to extremism and give them skills and hope and connections and relationships that make them want to be part of society and not separate. So that's a business idea. Get business people to volunteer their time and go into these regions. Well, those are some of the ideas around the world, but what about the United States? So in the United States versus the world, this is just one measure from the Pew studies that I used to direct, is government restrictions on religion. And the story in the United States is concerning. So restrictions on religious freedom from the government have gone up in the United States. They're higher now than the world median. So before, the United States could be considered maybe a world leader on religious freedom, but as I've mentioned already, Brazil is number one. We're not, the United States isn't number one. So there's a number of issues, some that you may have in mind. One that I have in mind is that more than a third of U.S. workers say that they have encountered religious discrimination in their job. Either not being able to worship on their Sabbath day, or not being able to take their religious holidays, or their religious dress not being accommodated, or just even the sense that religion is not welcome in the workplace. Leave it at the door when you come in. So this is a problem, a feeling. This is a survey of the U.S. workforce finding that people are feeling this. So what could be done? What are some ideas of ways that we can do that? Well, as sort of the argument I'm making throughout the whole presentation is that religious freedom is good for business and vice versa. Business is good for religious freedom. And it's just, if nothing else, it's a matter of fairness and equality. You shouldn't be discriminated against because of your faith orientation, right? It's just a very natural thing. And so maybe a new paradigm to think about religious freedom in the United States and in the workplace is to think of how the workplace should be Ford-friendly, a Ford-friendly business. I'm using the European acronym because I think it's quite useful in this context. Freedom of religion or belief-friendly business. So what you believe, whether you want to have a belief, change your belief, or have no belief at all, that's really important. It's an important right that people value and need to be respected. And we want you to feel freedom in our workplace and in the business to have your beliefs, not have your beliefs, but this is important fairness issue in the workplace. And so this is an idea that I'm going to end with and sort of throw out for discussion. Any thoughts on this? Rather than approaching religious freedom as in the United States, a First Amendment issue, maybe it's just a fairness issue. Just like you don't discriminate on the basis of gender, you don't discriminate on the basis of age, don't discriminate on the basis of religion either. A different paradigm. Well, that's if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be glad to hear them. But the basic question is, I've shared some of what I'm doing. What are you going to do? So, some questions?
We'll take a few questions now. If you could raise your hand and wait until I give you the mic to ask your question, that'd be great.
Dr. Grimm, thanks so much. Rob Schwarzwalder with the Family Research Council. You noted in one of your final charts an acceleration of restriction on religious liberty in the United States. Could you give a couple examples of what's transpired in the last few years?
Yeah, so in the data that I shared come from the Pew Research Center, and many of the government restrictions that are counted in that study are at the local level. So it's an increase, so it counts not just constitutional or national level issues, but it includes zoning issues, it includes accommodation of religion in schools or in public arenas. So if schools are not allowing public schools, which are a government agency, are not allowing religious groups to meet within the school, and say in a sense discriminating against them, but allowing the water skiing club to meet. That would be a kind of restriction. Another kind of discrimination is also accommodating the growing religious diversity of the United States. So some town councils will put up barriers to building new places of worship, and the majority of those are problems faced by Christian groups, but disproportionately religious minorities face problems. Such as building a mosque in a new town. It's a new faith that people have never seen before. They watch the news, they think, well, they must be like these people, ISIS in Iraq, and so then there's a nervousness there, and then you may have town councils or even politicians speaking out against it. But I think at least on that issue, from an American perspective on religious liberty, that there is a concern to have any faith group to be able to worship and have freedom within the country. So often these kinds of issues that come up in the United States, there are mechanisms to address them. They can be addressed in the courts, they can be addressed through reason. So I would say that the U.S. ranking on this is, it's not surprising for a country as large and diverse. We're the third most populous country in the world after China and India. So it's not surprising that we face these kind of issues, but there are mechanisms within the U.S. to try to address them. Still, that trend line was not one that I think most Americans would find encouraging.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I learned a lot of new stuff. Didn't realize how much there was to learn about the subject. I want to ask you about Brazil. You brought it up as one that has a lot of religious freedoms. Do you feel like America would become more religiously free if we took the Brazil approach to gay marriage? I know they actually allow gay marriage for people who have a religious minority who feel that is something that's socially appropriate. How would you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how religious freedom and acceptance of gay marriage and religious freedom are one is related to the other, but I could say that in the United States, because the gay marriage LGBT rights issue is often viewed in opposition to religious liberty, that's caused a great tension in the United States. So at least the way forward that I see in addressing that is perhaps to put religious freedom maybe in the same context as the LGBT issue has been framed, which is, we're trying to work together as a diverse population, and therefore, out of fairness, we need to respect different viewpoints. So the issue that I'm most concerned about in the U.S. is that religious freedom's now become, by many people's standards, a partisan issue. So that that doesn't seem very American to me, that religious freedom should be a partisan issue. So part of the partisanship may be related to these social hot button issues. And some of it is what's done with certain court cases, like the Hobby Lobby case, if you're familiar with that. So it's a closely held company by very committed Christians, and they objected to having to provide certain contraceptives as part of the Affordable Health Care Act mandate, or Obamacare as it's sometimes called. And so that went to the Supreme Court, and then they were allowed to provide the health care minus the 4 of those drugs that could cause abortions in their estimation. So then, but once that was passed, then that set up a case where it's interpreted religious rights against, women's rights. And this just is, I don't think a productive or even, winnable conversation, because these rights shouldn't be in conflict with each other. So I'm not exactly, as you can tell by my presentation, I really focus on the world and not the U.S. So I'm not a U.S. expert, even though I'm an American. But my hunch, by seeing how these things operate in the rest of the world, is that if we can put religious freedom not just as a litigation issue, but as a fairness issue, that can be a step forward.
Billy Graham had made a statement, I'm not going to remember exactly, to the effect of the next great revival or awakening in America would come through, business or the marketplace. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I met with, there's someone from the Billy Graham Association that I met with who is working on religious freedom issues, and I asked him, well, how have you engaged with business people on this topic? And his first thought was, well, actually we get big business people together and we tell them what we're doing in the association, and then we pass the hat around. It's the engagement with business. And so I'm not answering your question directly, but I think there is a general approach from faith-based organizations, churches, and others, that they view the business community as donors and supporters as opposed to players. And if I can go back to my example from Finland, as I met with the leadership of the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission, and we talked about how this would be their strategy for religious freedom, their international advocacy. I said, well, you really now need to reach out to the business community, because you're going to need business skills to help think through these approaches, not just humanitarian aid people, but business. And they sat back and they said, that might be really a paradigm shift within the church, within their church, because now business is going to be part of the strategy rather than just somebody you go to for donations. So I'm not sure I can answer your question directly, but I think there is something in the business community, because it's the crossroads of culture, creativity, and commerce. So it comes from people's faith. So I guess I would hope that within businesses there's the ability of people's faith to let their faith inform some of their ethics, if not innovative ideas like the next innovation in breakfast.
Dr. Grimm, thank you for having us here. Harry Driscoll from Moody Insurance Worldwide. This is my question. The thought just occurred to me that maybe is there any information about these kind of things happening in Iraq or Afghanistan, those kinds of areas of the world where religious freedom seems to be squelched? Is there any activity in those areas as far as business?
Yeah, well, one example, I was just in Istanbul for a meeting, the first meeting of this Business for Peace platform within the UN. And there were two women from an American and an Iraqi woman who run a business together in Baghdad. And so I was talking to them about what I'm doing, and I'm looking for examples of how businesses are promoting or, fostering interfaith understanding, peace, religious freedom. And they said, oh, well, we don't do that. And they do consulting and help set up business, they provide support for businesses that are starting throughout Iraq. And I said, well, let me clarify that. So in your company, do you have interfaith issues, or are you anything? They said, well, actually, our whole company, it's a woman-led, female-led company, and the one lady is a Sunni, another was a Shia, the American lady was a Christian, and somebody else was a Kurd. And then they said, we have probably one of the most religiously diverse workplaces that they can think of. So I think that sometimes businesses, even in these tough places, may be doing things that they don't realize what an exciting example it is. So like in Indonesia, different example, but in Indonesia, it's a country that has a rising number of religious hostilities. The Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu business owners, who are all minorities, Muslims are the majority, are going to great efforts to provide prayer rooms for the Muslim employees. So even though they're not a Muslim, they're doing that. Then they'll provide a prayer room for the Christian employees. And I said, well, that's actually unique. They think it's just normal. But I said, you're actually doing something that is showing respect to the other and providing for that. And so that, that's an example in the case study that I highlight. So I think that, part of my research is trying to find these things. And I'm encouraged that these, such initiatives exist out there and could be stimulated by even just sharing the experience of other companies. Maybe one more question?
Dr. Grimm, you said that restrictions come from government and society, and for the 43% of countries that you said were hostile towards religious freedom, can you give any examples of countries that were placed there because society was hostile, but the government was not?
Yeah, so in generally speaking, there's a very close association. So where you have government restrictions on religion, that tends to help stimulate social hostilities. So, for instance, in the case of Pakistan, that's extremely high in social hostilities involving religion. Some of that is then triggered by government policies such as the blasphemy law, then is used by people to stoke, tensions and criticize others. So really the pattern across the world is to have high social hostility, the two work in tandem. The biggest exception to that has been China, and I say has been China because China has had relatively low social hostilities but high government restrictions, which then in China they say, well, see, it works. We're keeping those hostilities down. But the data show that China went from having low social hostilities to this past year going into the high territory. So so then the concern for the Chinese is, are those social hostilities going to grow? And their policy is to put more pressure on religion to try to hold them down. But if there is such a thing as a social law, that tends to be counterproductive unless you're willing to apply overwhelming force. That those social hostilities will overwhelm the attempts to keep them down through force.
Is all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you guys for coming out in the rain to hear our lecture today, and I hope you have a great day.